Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today we're finishing up with World Video Bible School's video on why creationists don't seem to publish in reputable journals. At least not when their papers have anything to do with creationism. There are plenty out there who manage to get published when talking about fields that are irrelevant, or when they lie about what they think the age of the Earth is. There are plenty that publish in peer-reviewed journals that use scientifically accepted ages for the Earth and universe, which means that they are either lying when they present creationism, or they are lying when they author those papers. Either way, I thought lying was supposed to be a bad thing. Anyway, on to the video!
Thus, if a paper even hints at something other than a natural explanation, it's rejected as unscientific, regardless of the facts or research that's presented in the paper.
Can you explain any mechanism that is not natural? What mechanisms does this supernatural thing use? How does it operate? Does it perform consistently? Is there a natural explanation for the same phenomena? Now, maybe at some point in the future, someone will figure out a way to test for supernatural causation that doesn't definitionally bring the supernatural into the realm of the natural, but at the moment, saying supernatural, no matter which flavor of supernatural is your preferred flavor, is essentially just saying magic. You literally want that comic with the guy solving math equations invoking a miracle to get from one point to another to be an acceptable scientific proposition, and if you can't see why that would be a problem, then I honestly don't know what to say.
Creationist papers aren't rejected from peer-reviewed journals because they're not scientific. They're rejected because they don't give naturalistic explanations.
And since science is concerned with studying nature and figuring out how nature works, explanations that have nothing to do with nature and are not naturalistic are scientifically useless. Tell me, let's pretend that John Baumgartner was right. There was a flood, and the reason it was able to happen despite it breaking several laws of physics was that God temporarily changed or suspended the laws of physics for that event. How does that increase our understanding of how the world works? It doesn't. You may as well be saying magic. And considering that creationist papers are usually not very well written, the fact that they don't get published in reputable journals is unsurprising even if they didn't appeal to magic as their mechanisms. After all, that error that Snelling made in his 1996 paper, where he simply copied data from the wrong column of a table, likely would have been caught by peer reviewers. Had it somehow been missed, after publication, someone would surely point out that error, which would cause the paper to either be retracted or corrected. But in the nearly quarter century since Snelling's paper was published, his faulty table has been copied several times over by creationists, and there are no fewer than 3 creationist websites still up to date that use this chart. This serves to demonstrate the general apathy among creationists for critically examining their sources. Now tell me, do you think that a paper whose conclusion relies on data that was incorrectly copied down from the wrong column of a table in another paper should be published? Or should they maybe correct that error first?
You see, it's clear that the oft-repeated accusation against creation science's lack of peer-reviewed papers is seen for what it is, an intentional exclusion.
Yes, scientists intentionally exclude non-scientific ideas from publication in peer-reviewed journals. Though, as I pointed out in part 1, this exclusion is not nearly strict enough with regards to some pseudosciences.
Based not on the merits of the paper, but on the agreed upon, but very false, definition that true science entails only natural explanations.
We're still waiting for any evidence of a non-natural explanation for anything. The more we look into things and only look for natural explanations, the more natural explanations we find, and our lives are better for it. For centuries to millennia, supernatural explanations were the norm, but in the last century or so, science has progressed significantly faster than it has ever done before in history. Most poor people in developed countries today live more comfortable lives than royalty did just 1 or 2 centuries ago. You know, back when scientists like Newton could propose God as the explanation for Mercury's strange orbit and get away with it. Science moves faster when you don't stop at an unknown and say, that must be God. That is the most useless explanation that could possibly be proposed, and it will lead to no new knowledge. And I emphasize this in part 1, but just to go over it quickly again, this is in no way saying that religious people cannot be scientists. In fact, some of the biggest names in scientific history belong to people who were devoutly religious and saw science as their window into figuring out how God did what he did. That's even how Darwin started out, having graduated with his degree in theology. Hell, some of the greatest scientific discoveries of the medieval period came from Islamic scientists who were figuring out astronomy, the circulatory system, the nervous system, and even some chemists who were warning against alchemy almost 1,000 years before Newton would waste a good chunk of his time trying to figure alchemy out. My point is not that religious people cannot do science, but rather if you go in looking for supernatural explanations, you are not going to make any significant advances. But if you go in looking for natural explanations, then you just might figure out how some aspect of nature works.
The scientific establishment's stance is similar to that of a child who forms an exclusive club, and one of the stipulations for membership being that all members must be extremely smart.
I mean, there are unintelligent scientists out there. They usually don't publish quite as often, if at all, but they do exist. It is entirely possible to have extremely well-educated people that are still not intelligent.
The child then includes in the bylaws that all smart people should think that he, the founding member, is always right.
Are you sure you're talking about peer-reviewed journals and not the creationist organizations here? I mean, it's the creationist research journals that all explicitly state that you have to agree with their conclusions before they'll even consider publishing your paper, not the secular journals. Is that not exactly what you are outlining here?
Thus, he concludes that those who don't think he is always right are not smart.
As I pointed out in part 1, being published in a peer-reviewed journal is certainly a significant step on the road to becoming a scientific idea, but it is by no means the only qualification. And also, just getting published does not automatically make an idea scientific.
And then he proceeds to malign those not in the club based on the idea that they're not smart.
And this goes back to the fact that creationism still has all of its work ahead of it before it can get anything published. In order to be considered scientific, you first have to disprove several entire fields of science, like geology, paleontology, biology, archaeology, and more. And every year, creationists fail to do this. And every time creationists fail at this task, the task gets bigger as more discoveries are made in the fields that they would need to disprove in order to get their ideas taken seriously.
And as proof that they're not smart, he says that obviously they're unintelligent because they're not members of his club.
This analogy kind of falls apart, though, considering a couple things. Firstly, peer review, as I've said before, is only a part of the process of an idea becoming scientific. But probably more telling, this peer review club is nowhere near as exclusionary as you're making it out to be. Again, refer back to my little acupuncture rant in part 1. But also, you could go over to retractionwatch.org and take a look at what kind of ridiculous studies get published and then retracted, and then keep in mind which ones don't get retracted. Oh, and also, fun fact, while browsing Retraction Watch, that's when I found out that intelligent design advocates actually managed to push through a paper into the Journal of Theoretical Biology. How did they do it? Well, for starters, they concealed their ties to intelligent design organizations, which constitutes a failure to report a conflict of interest. They also waited until their paper was accepted before adding intelligent design to the keywords for the paper. Interestingly, once these shenanigans were discovered, the journal issued a disclaimer but has not retracted the paper. Ordinarily, a failure to disclose conflict of interest is more than adequate for a retraction, but this suggests that the editors of the journal didn't necessarily see a problem with the actual methodology of the paper itself, which is about the fine-tuning of molecular biology. And just to quickly go over it, they essentially work out that of all possible systems, the biological systems that we see on Earth are exceptionally unlikely to happen if they were generated randomly. So the whole premise of the paper fails, really, as it is well known that biological systems were not generated randomly. Evolution and natural selection act on a pool of existing variation, not with some completely random system generator of some kind. The whole paper boils down to there are lots of possible systems, so the fact that we have specific systems in existence means that these systems must have been fine-tuned. So yes, intelligent design papers can get published, but even then, this paper is really weak. It's already got a letter pointing out the flaws in it, written by 3 researchers from Georgia Institute of Technology. And when I say already, I mean it. The original paper was just published in June. So look out for the next flurry of intelligent design videos claiming persecution because the journal felt the need to place a disclaimer outlining their dishonest behavior for this paper.
Circular reasoning at its finest.
Indeed. Had your analogy held, it certainly would have been circular reasoning. Unfortunately, your analogy works a lot better for the creationist-run journals than it does for the reputable journals.
In reality, the motivation for castigating those outside his club is simply the fact that they disagree with him.
You don't know how the publication process works, do you? You can sometimes find two papers that come to opposite conclusions published in the same journal. In fact, it's rather normal for scientists from competing teams that have opposing opinions on some issue to go back and forth with competing papers, each disproving the last. That's still going on with Mary Schweitzer's 2005 discovery of soft tissue inside a dinosaur bone. There have been numerous papers published since then, both agreeing with her original conclusion and challenging it, with the latest round being a 2017 paper suggesting that the results were due to cross-contamination, and a 2019 paper examining the same T-Rex specimen and coming to the same conclusion as Dr. Schweitzer, supporting her original conclusion. Disagreement is one of the fundamental aspects of science. If one paper gets published and everyone just agrees with it just because it passed peer review, then that would severely hinder scientific progress. After all, the ultimate peer review comes after publication. The initial review is just to suss out any obvious problems, but as soon as it's published, it is then scrutinized by thousands of other scientists working in that same field, so any non-obvious problems will then become apparent.
Which is the same motivation that propels the evolutionary establishment to reject all creation science articles.
No. Creation science articles are rejected out of hand because they're not even close to being scientific. It's akin to astrology. You won't find very many papers published by astrologers, and when astrology does come up in scientific journals, it's usually something along the lines of figuring out how many people believe in astrology. Astrology is rejected because we know that astrology does not work and cannot work. It has no mechanism by which it even could work. Creation scientist articles are in a similar position, except much worse, because astrology wouldn't require so many entire disciplines to be wrong before it could be plausible.
You're not going to find articles advocating intelligent design in the majority of peer-reviewed journals.
And that is as it should be.
Not because the findings aren't scientific, but because they fail to provide evidence and proof of the conclusions as naturalistic.
Please, go ahead and show me some science-based evidence for anything outside of the natural world. I will be patiently waiting. Oh wait, what's that? You don't even want the supernatural to be the conclusion? You just want the supernatural to be the mechanism that leads to your physically impossible conclusion? That's actually much worse than just concluding something with the supernatural.
The truth is, many of the best articles ever written never make it into peer-reviewed journals because they mention creation and provide data to support that correct, accurate conclusion.
Well, I'm actually kind of surprised that we got through this one without Mr. Butt bringing up any of the creationist journals, though he did kind of hint at their existence toward the end there. But that statement was just wrong, though. If they were actually some of the best scientific articles ever written, then they wouldn't have a problem getting published, creationist conclusions or no. The problem is, creationists start with their conclusions and then disregard any data that runs contrary to that conclusion, which ends up being the vast majority of the data. And to call a scientific paper one of the best when it relies on ignoring a bunch of relevant data seems like more than a bit of a stretch. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Solder Girl, who says, "There is one argument in favor of the simulation hypothesis. It would explain why everything in nature seems to be quantized. The units of the Planck scale would be the resolution of the simulation system." Well, firstly, let me just congratulate you on obviously being from one of the regions of the world where they spell favor correctly. Secondly, I may well be wrong on this, but no matter how small you go, don't you eventually have to get to the smallest fundamental particle? Meaning that this isn't evidence that it's a simulation, it's just how it is. Now, quantum physics messes with my brain though, so if my intuitions are wrong here, I wouldn't be shocked. That being said, the best argument in my opinion in favor of the simulation hypothesis is the year 2020. The kid running the simulation got bored, and now it's at the point where they throw everything at their sims to see how they handle it. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, Jerry the Berry, David Schinkel, Lynn Dobbs, Mark McManus, What Jesus, and all the rest, who are the reviewers who reject the science that is my channel from publication. If you'd like to be perfectly reasonable, since my channel definitely should not be in any reputable journal, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, which are linked in the description, as well as links to my social media account and my P.O. Box address. See you next time!